Hello and welcome to Free Your Mind with Dr. Sheena Mason. Today, I had the distinct pleasure of talking with Dr. Carlos Hoyt. Carlos explores race, racial identity, and related issues as a scholar, teacher, psychotherapist, parent, and racialized member of our society. He interrogates master narratives and the dominant discourse on race with the goal of illuminating and virtuously disrupting the racial worldview. Dr. Hoyt has a TED Talk, which I'm linking in the description box for you, and he's also the author of a book, The Arc of a Bad Idea. I'll also link that in the description box for you. Carlos is absolutely wonderful, amazing, brilliant, all of the feels, all of the things. And I'm really feel truly honored and blessed and privileged to be having conversations with him and with plans to work together more in the future. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Let us know in the comment section what you think, how do you see race, how do you see racism, what do you think about the solution to racism, how can we get there? Let me know. Please like, comment, subscribe if you're not already part of the family. Step into Theory of Racelessness. Learn more. I'm all about sharing information and having conversations with people who think similarly to me and who don't think similarly to me, which of course is the vast majority of people, but all in good faith and all in an effort and desire to share information, to share not just the sort of evidence or logical aspect of certain aspects of the topic as it pertains to racism, but also the emotional and spiritual work that is required to do this type of work in the first place as well. And really centering and leading with love as I converse with people. So I welcome you, step into Theory of Racelessness if you haven't already, and enjoy this conversation. Also, I want to give a special shout out to my patrons for supporting my endeavors, for putting their money where their mouth is, as the saying goes, because I really and truly depend on the support in order to continue doing this type of work. So shout out to you, Brooke, Steve, Gilbert, Lucas, and Andy. Andy, who has been with me the longest from day one when I was expecting to get absolutely zero support. He started supporting me first, and yeah, I'll always remember that. So thank you to my patrons, and hopefully you'll join the list. Enjoy the conversation. Carlos, I'm so excited and thrilled to be talking with you today. I'm sure many of my supporters are aware of your work, but for anyone who's not, please, I invite you to share a bit about yourself and your work and what's motivating you to have this conversation with me today.
Well, I actually want to start with the last thing you said, what's motivating me to have this talk. I am so delighted and encouraged to have fallen into your company. In 1997, a now retired, I guess Rainier is an, I may get this wrong, anthropologist, I could be wrong about that, but he was a teacher, writer, speaker. He's still alive, but now resting from his work a little bit. He wrote an article or an essay called Race and Mixed Race, a Personal Tour. So this is Rainier Spencer. And one of the quotes that I use quite a bit from Rainier when I'm talking about this stuff goes like this. My journey has taken me past constructions of race, past constructions of mixed race, and into an understanding of human difference that does not include race as a meaningful category. I discovered Rainier when I was putting together my dissertation work, yikes, back in what, 2012-ish, 13-ish, whatever it might have been, that led to the book that I wrote and got published in 2016. And I had some lovely talks with him because he's a lovely person and super smart. And one of the things I said, to Rainier is that I'm so excited, to have found you. Like, who are the others who think this way? And Rainier said something like, Carlos, I'm pretty much a lone wolf in this area. I'm surprised to have bumped into you. And now it is, I don't know, 10-ish or so years later, and I'm looking at you and talking with you. And I don't say this in a way to be ageist at all, but as somebody who's growing old, and I like that I'm growing old, to see someone, with your youth and vigor, and also embracing this, I'll call it an outlook, and I'll say more about that later, but this outlook on not just race and racial identity, but identity, I think in some very important and sort of general ways, is such a comfort and inspiration. And I can't wait to tell Rainier about you, because I'm going to, and he'll be happy to know that his legacy is moving on, certainly through me and others, and now through you. So that is, part of my motivation in wanting to spend some time with you. And then just to learn, I love, talking about this stuff. I love trying to, make space for folks to explore and share their bearing on this pretty complicated and super important topic. In terms of my own path towards it, I'm really fortunate, to sort of enjoy the benefits of being a culture straddler in so many ways. I was born in Costa Rica, came here when I was about 3.5 years old. In some ways, a typical sort of virtuous immigrant story. My folks were far from prospering in Puerto Limon, Costa Rica, when my sister and I were born. Neither of my folks, had the benefit of a great education, nothing even past the middle school years. And there was a time in this country where, folks were looking for domestic service in the New England area. And my mom and some of her girlfriends decided to take that adventure, come up and work as maids, basically, try to bank some money enough to send back home and have the family come out. And that's what happened for my sister and my father and I about a year after my mom had landed in the Dorchester area and was working as a maid in Newton, which is a pretty wealthy suburb of Boston here. She tells this really lovely but sad story that when we finally connected in Logan, like, I didn't really recognize her, which is just typical developmentally of where I was at that point. You leave a 3-year-old, they will defensively sort of forget about you. And I think she's been trying to make it up to me ever since. I have a wonderful relationship with my mother, who's super sweet. So I landed here, and grew up as a adversely racialized Black male in this country, right? That's how people saw me and treated me. So whether it was at school or just out in the world, I was living, the experience of somebody who was known to be quote unquote Black in this society. At the same time, I was going home, to folks who knew themselves as Ticos, from Costa Rica. And while there were certainly classism and racial issues in Costa Rica, they don't necessarily map onto the way we do it here. So my folks certainly knew discrimination, but it was very interesting for me to be living with parents who didn't have the legacy ingrained in them of the American race experience, and then going out into the world and living it every day. And it allowed me to just sort of compare and contrast, and I think sort of scrutinize what's really going on here, what makes sense and what doesn't. Over time, especially, during my adolescence, I got to be in that moment when, Black power was sort of ascendant and having racial pride was ascendant. And there were even some sort of policy attention being paid to how do we promote and take care of, this group of people who are pretty subjugated. So I benefited from some scholarships, and because I was, able to do some things academically that not everybody around me could do, I sort of got some positive attention from being the quote unquote, smart Black kid, right? So I was experiencing some of those positives. The young, gifted, and Black experience, was sort of draped around me like a comforting blanket. At the same time, I thought, well, what is that about? Is there something essential to me that makes me either good at things or not good at things because of this so-called race thing? And it never really, seemed comfortable or legitimate to me that there was anything essential to it, that there was a narrative, that we were all sort of trapped into around this. And that developed over time into a deep urgency and interest to really study this in academic ways. So when I finally finished my sort of regular path of schooling right through my master's program, I decided to dedicate some PhD years to really studying this. And the project that came out of that was a long title, like most dissertations are, sort of understanding people that were termed race transcenders. And that was not my term. It actually belongs to somebody named Carrie Ann Rockamore, who was a sociologist at the time, I think of U Chicago. And she did the then largest study of biracial identity that had been done. And Carrie Ann went into her study hypothesizing, theorizing that she'd come out with sort of 3 identity destinations for folks who identified as biracial. And for her, that meant folks who had one self-identified white parent, one self-identified Black parent. And she thought the destinations would be either that someone would be, strictly white in terms of their identification, or strictly Black, so one or the other, that's one. That someone might be sort of on the border, inhabiting the space that they said was not one, not the other, but somehow both. Or there would be a group that she calls sort of protean, and they would sort of go back and forth depending on the circumstance. And she actually found that there were people who fit into those categories. And then she found a 4th category that she didn't expect. There was like 13% of her population that just rejected race altogether. That said, I'm human, I don't want to be white, I don't want to be Black, those things don't exist, it diminishes me to talk about me this way. And she termed those folks race transcenders. And in addition to Rainier's work, I found that part of her work to be super encouraging. Here is empirical evidence that there are people who are optically, being identified for the most part as Black or brown, even though some of them were light enough to be what we call passing, but who rejected the idea, of being racialized in that way. And in one of my talks with Carrie Ann, I said, I understand that your study was, by definition, limited to folks who identify as biracial. Do you see any reason why the study of race transcendence could be extended to folks who are just identified as Black? And she said, don't see any reason why. And off I went. I ended up interviewing 10 people and sort of getting their story of, how in a society like ours did they arrive at such a disposition? What does it mean to live that way, et cetera, et cetera. And out of that came the book, The Arc of a Bad Idea, which is a super academic book. It's not necessarily for popular consumption. I always apologize when I say that, but I'm working on something else that'll be more accessible. But that also led to opportunities to do short videos for Oxford and lots of workshops, and most recently the TEDx talk that I got to do last June. So I do hope that, the message of resisting racialization and correcting, our conditioned, I guess, misunderstanding of identity regarding race is getting out there in ways that are more and more digestible and accessible to people. And I'm doing my best to be part of that. So very long-winded introduction, I know, but that's how I got where I am, more or less.
Thank you so much. I've been, folks can't see me when you're highlighted as a speaker, but I've been cheesing the entire time and riveted. You see, I'm looking into my computer like this by what you're saying. And a lot of it resonates with me for reasons I think will be rendered clear when I say a bit. So I myself was adopted. My biological parents, one racialized white, one racialized Black, and they were unfit parents. And I know this because 2 of my biological brothers died under suspicious circumstances, which was the genesis for New York State taking away my 2 biological sisters from them. And then when I was born a few years later, I was taken away by the state of New York as well. And I was adopted by an immigrant from Panama and a racialized white man from upstate New York. And also adopted was my brother, who's racialized Black. So I grew up in a household that was really led and domineered by my adopted mother. I grew up going back and forth to Panama. Nobody in the family besides her spoke English, so I grew up bilingual, and I lived in a predominantly racialized white town. So to say that race as Americans tend to conceive it didn't make much sense to me from the beginning would be, I think, an understatement probably, because people almost immediately put all of these expectations in terms of who I was, how I would sound when I speak, or who I am culturally based on how I speak and based on how I look. All of these presumptions that ultimately, upon getting to know me, would turn out to be inaccurate. And when I moved out of that household on my 16th birthday because of the ironically severe abuse and neglect that I experienced at the hands of my adoptive parents, I found myself alone, sleeping on park benches, a high school dropout, um, and believing that there was more to life than what I had been shown in every regard, primarily because I read voraciously as a kid. That was one thing that I was very fortunate and privileged to have access to, is, any book that I wanted. And I took advantage of that. And it was the books that I read that gave me the sincere belief that, number one, everything was possible, and number two, there was more to life than what I was experiencing. And I've taken that idea with me at every step of the road. When I did graduate from high school a year later, after having to drop out, and then I went to undergraduate, was a student commencement speaker. When I was doing my undergraduate studies, I was really obsessed with learning more about how race gets essentialized in American society. And although I started out, this is one other connection too, although I started out as a psychology major, I ultimately changed it to be an English major because because of my experience with education, and in particular with reading, and the sort of transformative power that I imbued into that process. I kind of looked at African American literature in particular through that lens of experience indeed, and through the lens of wanting to really understand what ills our society, and why something like race operates in the ways that it does, and ultimately why racism operates in the ways that it does. And the part of me that felt like everything was possible and there was more to the world, and I was meant to do these, at the time I thought, really grand things, um it kind of culminated in a way that made me see my blackness as people told me I was black. Right? It wasn't because I felt that or knew it at any point, right? It's because people told me I was. And I took that labeling and I put everything positive that I saw about myself and that I saw in the world, that I saw in the literature that I read, into the category of blackness. And that also inspired me to view the work of the literature and the sort of genealogy of thought and activism in the literature in a way that I also assigned to blackness. So it's kind of interesting to reflect on my beginnings and see where I am intellectually and also emotionally now, because it makes perfect sense how the dots got connected to get me to where I am. But people have a hard time, for some, interesting reason. People have a hard time, I guess, believing or perhaps imagining that there was a time where I sincerely embraced race, the concept of race. I believed in it. I didn't disbelieve. And although I recognize the paradoxes immediately because of how essentialization comes into the conversation, I still was Black. I still saw myself as part of a race. And that also enables me to be very empathetic to people who see themselves in that particular way, right? Because I was there, I've lived it. I really do understand the emotional aspect that comes into this, as much as I can talk about it now from a sort of logical, knowledge-based perspective.
Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you for sharing your story. I think it's miraculous in some ways that you are where you are and that you've moved through that adversity the way you have. So thank you for letting me know that about you. And I think, the last thing you touched on, the empathy extended to folks who are strongly and positively, attached to the idea of racial identity and solidarity and agency and mobilization and all of that. I think it's crucial. I think empathy is crucial just in general. But from the time I started, talking about this and having the privilege of being able to talk about it with folks, it's Black and brown identified folks who I think I am most respectful of in this discourse, because although I've had wonderful, experiences of transformative moments where folks feel a sense of liberation, from the yoke of what I sometimes call the dogma of race. I've also encountered many Black and brown identified folks whose eyebrows go way up, when I start talking about, not just race as a social construct, but a social construct that should be resisted or corrected. And it's not because there's any intellectual disagreement. It's because it presents this kind of disorienting, cognitive dissonance. In my study, one of my subjects talked about his encounters with folks, Black and brown identified folks, who had adverse reactions to his movement towards sort of a racelessness orientation. And he said he was talking with an older Black identified woman on the bus one day, and he was wearing a shirt that said something like, there's no such thing as race, or, one of those t-shirts. And she sort of accosted him and said, like, we worked so hard, to get to a point, through the civil rights movement, et cetera, where there could be pride, in being Black. So what are you doing wearing that shirt? And I think that for me is sort of the crux of the difficulty in changing one's attachment to, relationship with something as central as the hinge of identity. This is what the world turns on for me. And now you're telling me that I have to what? Like take it away? What happens next? As a psychotherapist, one of the important principles is, don't take away a defense without being able to replace it with something else. Folks need their coping mechanisms, and the history is just so beautifully, if tragically clear as to why, folks who are oppressed, very often end up reclaiming, trying to rehabilitate, the very negative sort of label that's been placed on them. I think it's, it falls into what's called strategic essentialism and all that stuff, but it is understandable. So I think it needs to be respected and really honored as something that folks certainly have a right to, because anybody can identify in the way they want to, but have deep roots in. So I think we should be careful about how we move into that discourse with folks like that.
Absolutely. And something else I'm thinking of that resonates with me earlier, you were talking about the arc of a bad idea, and you were talking about this study of biracial, put that in quotation marks, biracial people, and the question that arose from reading that study and speaking with the author. Can you say her name again, please?
Carrie Ann Rockamore is her name. Let me see if
Carrie Ann Rockamore.
Hold on, we're sharing.
Carrie Ann Rockamore. I'm ever taking notes.
So, and I know you'll link to some of this stuff later, but so this is the first iteration of Carrie Ann's book, written with the help of David Brusma, who I've had some contact with, a lovely person. And then it got reissued in, I don't know what year, but there are 2 editions of this. And she just does a beautiful job giving a great deal of context about race and racial identity, and then talking through her study.
Yes. So that inspired for you the question of, I wonder if if this would also apply to people who aren't identified as biracial, or other people would say mixed. And that the same question, or the same sort of line of inquiry, arose for me because, so my PhD, my doctorate is in English literature, but I specialize in African American, American and Caribbean literature. And the subject of my forthcoming book is primarily African American literature, and I analyze and I talk about and sort of expose the ways in which the upholding of race ideology, even within the field that is ostensibly and in a lot of ways inevitably about liberation from racism, right, is also unintentionally upholding the problem of racism, because it's upholding race, which I see is ultimately being the same thing as racism. And one of the chapters, I look at three texts which have tragic mulatto characters, or traditionally those texts, you know, there's a whole genre, passing literature, a genre of this sort of stereotypical mulatto character who's tragic because they don't fit into the white world and they don't fit into the black world. And people have often looked at those characters as exemplifying a sort of attempt to mediate between white and black, and what does it look like to live in an integrated American society, and what is a sort of mode of transport to bring the American reader, the average reader, into this space and into this discourse about racism. And the mulatto figures for me were, I think, very clearly not about mediation, not about showing the sort of tragicness of a so-called mixed figure, but as showing the nonsensical nature of the concept of race itself, and that the tragedy is in the system, the sort of race ideology, which is perpetrating the racism that the character then has to face as an ostensibly mixed character. And because of the one drop rule, the mixed character gets labeled black, right? And because racism operates in the ways that it does, it gives this sort of appearance of tragedy, because the characters often have to navigate the tension of being able to pass for white, but then the sort of ethics and morality that get assigned to passing, and that sort of thing. So those characters for me, instead of reading them in the traditional way, I was seeing them as being indicative of the need to undo race, to undo racism. And that the characters were, those specific types of characters are more often than not the sort of embodiment of the undoing of race. But importantly, if people are unaware of the philosophies of race, that is the discipline within philosophy that helps people grapple with alternative philosophies of race, specifically skepticism and eliminativism, it becomes less likely or less common for people to engage with those characters in that way. They tend to interpret the characters as black, and then they write everything that race ideology encourages people to write onto those characters in terms of what that character is expected to do, how they're expected to move in the world, and how they're expected to view themselves as unequivocally and unquestionably black. And I had several conversations with my advisor about how, although I was applying the theory of racelessness in the framework to those types of characters in the one chapter, I saw that idea, the idea of undoing race to undo racism, as happening within other texts and within the real world as it pertains to people who are racialized as obviously fill in the blank. So for me, it wasn't their mulatto-ness, right, their mixedness that was inspiring the reading that I was gleaning from the text. It was the presence of race by extension, then the presence of racism in the first place that was inspiring the reading. So if you have other texts within the body of African American literature or Caribbean literature or American literature more broadly, if race is present, if race is being signified in some ways, then that to me is fodder for grappling with and understanding and really mining for meaning this possibility of, is what's being depicted here the necessity to undo race, to undo racism? And feedback that I get often enough to take note of it. And I just spoke with a young lady that recently who's in Canada, Violette. She was saying that people tell her, well, it's because you're mixed that you're able, that you think about race in this untraditional way or whatever. And it's often done as a way to devalue and diminish what a person is saying, right? But there are people like my wife who looks obviously Black, who agrees wholeheartedly with theory of racistness and with your ideas in terms of what race is, what it isn't, and what should be done with it. And historically, there are countless people who are obviously Black who have thought of race and conceived of race in these ways. So I guess one question I have for you is a sort of question about it's a question about how you see the idea of one's mixedness sort of interfering with people grappling with your ideas in a more meaningful way, perhaps, or if you think that because with your own book you kind of stepped outside of this idea of mixedness and biracial, just what are the conclusions that you end up drawing for people who are racialized in more obvious ways as it pertains to seeing oneself as a race transcender?
Yeah, it's a great and important question. I sometimes offer that one of the fundamental sort of challenges or problems with the way we talk about race and racial identity and racism is that we're failing to get to the root of the weed, is what I say as my metaphor. Taking the tragic mulatto as an example, where the tragedy, as it is constructed, of having a mulatto identity is like the weed that we see on the first surface of the lawn, and we keep plucking at it, but we're not getting down to the root of the problem, because the real tragedy is the construct of race, right? There's no mulatto-ness, there's no struggle between, am I going to be Black, am I going to be white, if there's no Black and white, if there's no racial substrate that keeps sort of producing and propagating, these myths that then people have to reckon with. I think that you are very generous, when you speak about, this perspective as a philosophy. I tend to think of, when I left my undergraduate degree experience, I had a BA in psychology, but I'd studied more philosophy than psychology because I just fell in love with it, but I didn't have the good sense of like double major because I'm just not smart in that way. And I ended up at UChicago studying philosophy for a year. And although it's still in my bones, I realized that sort of movement towards an ivory tower sort of existence was a little bit in conflict with my desire to serve, because I had started to work with underprivileged folks at that time. So with the good influence of a dear friend who became my wife, I left UChicago, came back home, studied social work, and the rest is history. But in terms of philosophy, I feel as if philosophy often connotes a sense of exchange of ideas, perspectives, arguments. Let's listen to each other, see where we settle. I see the business and the importance of the discussion about race and all things related, not so much as a philosophical enterprise, but as an empirical one. And to your viewers, I apologize if this sounds dogmatic, but I actually think there's a right and wrong here. There's no such thing as race. We know it. We are sort of operating in, a castle that's sort of floating in the air. And we do that with lots of social constructs. There's no such thing as nation. There's no such thing as money. Like, there are lots of social constructs that we're happy to live and die for. I get that. So one could say, why can't race be one of those? And my typical answer is, well, it can be. But if we have a choice, if it's not like that rock that if I hit it hard enough, I'm going to hurt myself every time. If I can actually choose whether or not to abide by this particular construct, why would I choose to abide by it? So, and you also mentioned eliminativism, and you referenced that I sometimes use this term correctivism. There's a lovely bookshare again, alert, called just A Realist Metaphysics of Race. Okay. And this is actually a philosophical book. It's written by a philosopher named Jeremy Price. So I'm going to read just a little section of the three options that Pierce, I'm sorry if I called him Price, sort of envisions as possible for race. So he writes, we might favor retaining racial categories pretty much as they are, and he calls that retentionism. So we'll just keep going with the way we've been for the past 400 or so years, even though that's been really fluid and nebulous, whatever that is, we'll retain it. We might seek to transform those categories without removing them entirely. He calls that revisionism. So that would be kind of where I think we are. Like, let's realize it's a social construct. Let's go for this thing that we call racial equality, but we're not going to get rid of race. And then finally, and I'm back to the book now, we might seek to eliminate any thought, language, or practices that involve race. And he calls that eliminativism. And I don't pretend that that's the same thing that you mean by it. But as I read Pierce, I was, one, very grateful, to have such a clear and succinct sort of, construction of the ways that we can approach and probably do approach this concept. But I also felt like they're all unsatisfactory to me. Retaining for me is like just not an option. Like, we ought not to buy into things that simply aren't true. Like, that's dangerous. Because once I can sort of prefer my thing that isn't true, then you can too, and yikes, how do we decide how to move? So there needs to be some empirical basis to it. Revising is also the same thing for me. Let's not revise something that's false on its face. And then the eliminativism is probably the most appealing to me, because if Carlos thinks it doesn't exist, then it's good to eliminate the thought of it. But it's not going to happen. I think race is so easily glommed onto, I think, by the human brain that loves to categorize, and so encourage, by the way that we do society, at least in this country, that getting rid of it would be like trying to eliminate the common cold, right? I think we are so susceptible to thinking in terms of categories and hierarchies, and race matches onto that so well, even though it's not empirically real, that we're not going to ban it. Like, it's just not going to happen. So the best we can do, at least in the short term, is recognize our susceptibility and do the best we can to, quote unquote, inoculate ourselves against it, right? A habit to be resisted, maybe not to be eliminated right away. So how do we correct? One, going back to our bit of a talk about empathy, we honor and have compassion for our vulnerability, to see each other in all sorts of ways that sometimes lead to positive things, pride and solidarity and all those things, but also, and this is the other edge, serve as a way to divide and lead to all sorts of hostility. We have to understand that we are always, if not deep into that, a step away from falling into it. It's just the way the human brain works, and it's supercharged to do that because of some social conditioning that we've had. So let's correct all the time. How do we do that? I'm an educator. We start with kids. We build on their already sort of natural philosophical bent and their ability to take in information without some of the contamination that comes as they grow up. And we get them to think critically about things. One of the things that is in at least one of my videos, more show and tell, involves these things, right? And I think it's in the TED Talk, right? They have numbers on them, et cetera, et cetera. And I've had so much fun with these jars with kids as young as 3 and 4, with just the basic questions. What do you see? Which two are more alike? What do you think is actually in here? Now that you know what's in here, which two are alike? And then the sort of dawning, right? Oh, I ought not to judge things just by their surface appearance, which is such a fundamental and maybe even simplistic message, but it's at the basis of, I think, is what's problematic for us. And that's what we need to correct for. And it doesn't obviously just apply to race. If I, having been conditioned, to be a male thinking person in this society, am interacting with you consciously or unconsciously based on, the optics that tell me, well, you must be female identified, which means what, et cetera, et cetera. If that's humming somewhere in the back of my brain, it's probably influencing, what I'm thinking and maybe even what I'm saying, whether I know it or not. I know that I'm susceptible to that, right? So I try to be anyway, on guard, for any negative effects of that. Some of them might even seem to be positive, right? So I tend to be a protector and a superhero, and that probably shows more with people who seem to be female identified than male identified. Like I have all that conditioning in me, right? I just want to acknowledge that and then figure out, what do I do with that? I would love to eliminate it and just be neutral in all regards, but I don't think it's possible. Right? So I'm going to do my best to be disciplined against the bad things that could happen coming out of that. And that's what I mean when I talk about correctivism.
Yeah, great. So let's talk more about this. My mind is going pew 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 pew. It's firing. So Pierce talks about retentionism, revisionism, and eliminativism, and all three of those categories speak to what a person thinks should be done with the concept of race. The language that I prefer to use from my mentor, the chair of the philosophy department at Howard University, would be conservationism, which obviously is the same as retentionism. Yeah. Eliminativism, that holds the same around the way. Revisionism, reconstructionism is what I use. So I was wanting you to definitely call on the language that you use so that we could share information. Like there are other ways to describe the same thing. I think in terms of when you're talking about what I'll call reconstructionism is spot on. It's what I tell people. It's that in American society, there are default philosophical positions that we're really primed to subscribe to. And I think the irony that comes with a constructionist, reconstructionist position is that it always gets packaged as progressive, it gets packaged as liberatory, it gets packaged as a form of resistance. But when you know more in depth the history of the concept of race in the first place, and you know that the iterations, as you say, it has never been stagnant, it has constantly been under reconstruction, and yet and still centuries later, if we see that the concept is still operating, although understood in somewhat different ways, still operating in ways that are nefarious, the reason for that, the primary reason why reconstructionism falls short of the actual goal of liberation from racism is because we are in reconstructing, really working to reconstruct racism, which kind of sounds nonsensical if I put it in those in that language, because as you said, it's really about getting to the root of the weed. And I love that you call it a weed. Instead, I've used the root metaphor often, but I'm always thinking of a tree. Like I'm not thinking of a weed, but I think a weed makes perfect sense. And so I'm going to borrow that and cite you moving forward. Yeah, I think getting to the root of the problem is really what has been a hindrance in the context of the United States in terms of transcending this thing called racism. And part of my sincere belief in eliminativism is because when I hear constructionism, and as you describe it, I hear reconstruction, but just packaged slightly differently. And I would argue that um, eliminativism, while it is a bit of a misnomer because it suggests that an eliminativist such as myself believes that we could actually completely eradicate the concept, thereby completely eradicating racism. And I don't believe that that is necessarily true. I think if we get to a point of especially focusing on the youth and not teaching them racism in the first place, because we're all taught race, which means we're taught racism because it comes hand in hand, really. If we can get to the root of that with our young people and start to stop teaching them race and teach them about racism, but teach them about race um, through the properly, redirected subject of racism. Like, we're examining race as a sort of historical concept that we no longer subscribe to, or that we recognize now that we don't have to subscribe to, and actually all of us in this room are raceless. And we encourage young people of in high school who've already globbed onto the American concept of race and the fanaticism and obsession with color and all of that, to de-racialize themselves. That work is necessary. And that work, I think, will go a long way toward the ultimate goal of eliminativism, because at some point, just as the majority of our society came to subscribe to this particular ideology, we can reverse engineer the same thing. We can't if we don't believe that we can, but we can. And we start with the young people, and across, a couple generations, I do think it would be eradicated. And you might have a very small percentage of people who are really intent on maintaining their racist ideas or the racist ideology, but that ultimately it would be a very small percentage of people. And we don't need every single person to be an eliminativist to achieve eliminativism, because really, as I look at it anyway, it's about the statistical majority of people being an eliminativist, and then the policies and the procedures and the ways of the land, right, will come to inevitably reflect the majority, and that over time will lead to a more absolute societal structure where, again, it's like a tiny percentage of people who are just really intent on holding on to the thing called race. I believe sincerely that we can get to that, because, and part of what inspires me and part of the work that I do through theory of racelessness is I help people relativize the concept. When you were talking about your parents coming from Costa Rica, and you were talking about this sort of acclimation into American society and how Americans conceive of themselves and identity and race and all of that, and that was in some ways different from their experiences in Costa Rica. There are a lot of countries across different times that we can look to that have completely different concepts of race. So racism, as I spell it with the word race in it, doesn't travel if they have a concept of race at all. And where race doesn't exist, that's not to say there aren't hierarchies. Of course, there are hierarchies. You and I both know, and you've already testified to the fact that humans tend to do this to themselves and other people, right? There are hierarchies, and those hierarchies in other countries might be more ethnicity based or nationality based. In some ways, those two overlap. So I'm not talking about paradise be existing anywhere else, right? Because capital R race doesn't exist in every place. But part of the journey for people, and I think part of what it can give people hope and help people feel heartened, is the knowledge and insight that this thing that we take for granted and that we, in some ironic ways, think is objective, sort of objective reality of race. If we look, across the ocean or whatever, we come to find out that that's not how people conceive of themselves, right? And I think that means a couple of things. It means that American society doesn't have to continue to always operate in this way. And I think that it means that there was a time before America became the United States, before it became officially America, there was a time when race didn't exist anywhere close to how it exists today. And so it almost brings us back to our sort of pre-American roots. And one book that explores that idea, it's a book of fiction, is Toni Morrison's book, A Mercy, where she explores a sort of pre-American and pre-race or pre-racialization context. And I don't know, I think for all of those reasons that I'm hoping are clearer, I'm a staunch eliminativist, but I'm also a skeptic. And I don't know if Pierce talks about, does he talk about the other philosophies of race that speak to what a person thinks race is, like constructionism, naturalism, all of that?
Yes, he does, and I won't, do him justice if I try to sort of speak for him, but I will, respond to your very wise words. And just to be clear, when I speak about sort of the arc of this bad idea, it is arcing towards being eliminated in just the ways you talked about. I guess if I'm trying to create a dialogue between, my use of the correctivist approach and your desire and advocacy for eliminating the whole thing, I would say that the first facilitates the second, right? That by adopting a corrective stance to this thing that is a pretty well ingrained habit, we will eventually break the habit, right? And as you say, it doesn't mean that some folks won't still carry it. So that's one thing I want to be clear, that I have no disagreement with you about that at all. It's a process maybe issue. The other thing I would say is that the resistance to racialization, conceptually and I think pragmatically, takes care of the problem of race and racism. But it's not just about this thing that we call race. When I talk about racialization, I always feel a little bit frustrated with myself because I feel as if I'm inviting people to think about this super important concept in terms of just one ism, and that's racism. So, as a really brief, sort of reminder or primer, when I think about racialization, I'm talking about a process, like an action process that involves selecting some attributes of a person that we use to then distinguish that person from other people. And we know what they are in race. And then sorting people accordingly, and then attributing things to them that are baseless, anecdotal, silly, harmful, etc. And then essentializing those differences so that they can't be changed. Once you're this, you're always this, right through the generations. And then finally acting on them. That is beautifully applied to race. And when I found that concept in some law documents in Canadian government, that is the context they were being used in. But I often say, and I don't get to talk about it a whole lot, that term racialization and that process could easily be called otherization or alienization, or whatever word just breaks it out of any particular social identity cast, right? Because it is what we do to each other. The resistance to that proclivity, is mostly what I'm talking about when I talked about correcting, because you can slot out gender for race and, sexual orientation for gender and relimit. It's just good. It keeps happening because we are so inclined to do that. And that's what I think really has to be resisted. And it's on that sort of grand level where I say it's hard to eliminate all of that, because everywhere you turn, the brain is ready, right, to do that thing that seems really logical and maybe even helpful, but can be really destructive. And you and I are talking about it particularly in the realm of race. But again, I don't want there to be any sort of confusion. Yeah, the goal is to eliminate. And I actually think the race one is on its way. And then the others, I think they will continue to be attenuated, in terms of their toxicity and sort of vigor and impact once we develop a better discipline around critical thinking, and just checking ourselves. Which means we have to be humble and say, like, yep, we can go there. We're primed to go there all the time. Let's try not to go there as much. And eventually, it'll be less and less and less. And as goofy as it sounds, the world will be a better place because of it.
Yeah, I know. Yes. I am, I'm thinking about how, so theory of racelessness, as is sort of indicated in the naming of it, right, is a theory and also inspired by philosophies of race, particular philosophies of race. And as such, when I talk about racialization and stuff, I'm talking about racialization as it pertains to race. But one thing that I found through my work is that when people are equipped to get outside of the black-white binary, to get outside of, to transcend the sort of race thinking and thereby transcending racism, it does result in a more critical a more critical way of viewing other binaries that prove to be productive. Because as you said, and as I was saying earlier, when I was saying, there's no place on earth that we could point to and say this is a paradise, because they've just figured out how to not do this to each other, right? To not
Well, there's
categorize.
this little nation that you and I have developed right here, so we'll live here for a while.
Well, listen, homie Baba points out the fact that nations are imagined, so this is our nation, and Reynard is in it, and it's small but growing. There's no place that we could point to where people don't other people based on certain characteristics. And in the United States, when we transcend racism, which I really believe we can and we will, there will still be these other hierarchies. But one important thing that comes from helping people transcend racism by transcending the idea of race is this effect of really bringing under the microscope the sort of us versus them mentality, because there's a lot of ways in which race in the US is used and sort of weaponized to keep the us versus them mentality going, whether it's left versus right, conservative versus progressive, me versus you. And it's put under the framework of white versus black, essentially. But when you help people outside the white versus black, then I do notice that it helps people really look critically and question everything. That's the thing that my students take away from me. The sort of mantra is really question everything, because even as it pertains to racism, there's a way in which when we're thinking from within the framework, we're often, not always, but often precluded from seeing the problem more clearly, which gets to this idea of we need to get to the root of the weed, because we're focusing on the dandelion, right? We're focusing on the thing that's coming out of the ground. And by focusing on that, it really is a distraction and a sort of smoke and mirrors situation. And when you can help people start to critique that in meaningful ways, and in ways that doesn't threaten their nucleus, right? In ways that indicate and perhaps highlight the fact that when we're talking about eliminating race, we're not talking about eliminating a person or eliminating a person's culture or eliminating ethnicity or things that are meaningful. We're talking specifically about race ism and the attaching ism, right? Everything else remains. And I think if everything else becomes clearer and we can be more astute and specific as it pertains to culture and ethnicity in particular, because we'll stop conflating it with race and we'll stop thinking of it therefore in black and white ways. So yeah, I'm definitely in agreement that we can't achieve paradise, meaning we can't achieve a sort of, there's no hierarchies whatsoever. I think it's an admirable goal for any of us to have, certainly. But I don't think it's achievable. But I do think that we can eliminate the one hierarchy. But it is unfortunate to also be cognizant of the fact that there will be other hierarchies, and perhaps a different one of those other hierarchies would replace that of racism, and then we have to work toward lessening our biases in that regard. But that doesn't deter me from doing the work against racism, because some people say it as a way to, some people say, well, there's always going to be hierarchy, as a way to suggest or state outright that I shouldn't be doing this work to eliminate racism. But I'm like, to me, that's not a counter argument. That's not, just because there are other hierarchies exist, or it might be replaced, or a different hierarchy will be elevated, is not going to deter me from doing what I think is the right thing. And as you said earlier, I don't ascribe morality to the problem of racism, because I think that people get too hung up in the moral aspects of it. And that shuts some people out who would otherwise be participatory in the conversation. So I don't really assign morality to it. But in the same sense, I'm with you when you said something to the effect of, you do think there's a right and a wrong way to look at this thing, right? And I would agree. I just kind of, for me, right and wrong doesn't necessarily mean like good and evil, right? Or good and bad. At least not in the ways that I see the sort of mainstream media treating good and bad, in very, again, pun intended, black and white ways. And then the last thing I want to say before I forget, I think your correctivism is, so the other philosophy that theory of racelessness reflects, the one is eliminativism, which speaks to what I think should be done with race. The first is something called skepticism. So the categories that a person can subscribe to in terms of how they conceive of race include naturalism, meaning I think it's biological, it's in nature. Constructionism, meaning, okay, I don't necessarily argue that it's biological, but I think society manifests race as real in some socially constructed, meaningful way. Or skepticism, which is where I sit, which is to say that I argue race is not biological and it's not a social construction. And while I recognize that the majority of people believe that it's biological or a social construction, that does nothing to satisfy my question of whether or not it's real, right? Just because people believe it's real doesn't mean it's real from my view as a skeptic. And as a skeptic, I argue that the thing people point to and say, this is race or this is racial, they're just misnaming other things that do exist for all intents and purposes, such as racism. So racism camouflages itself as race. To me, it's the same thing. Or they're conflating race with culture or ethnicity. Everything except race is being called indeed race. And in that way, we're misnaming the problem. So part of my work too is a sort of correctivism that happens through my skepticism, because I share people what skepticism is and the sort of genealogy of the ideas of skepticism as relayed in American society. And I am constantly sharing information about genetics and biology, trying to indeed correct, when possible, some people's misperceptions about how meaningful race is in any biological sense, or if it exists at all. And then also showing people an alternative to viewing it as a construction, because you'll get many constructionists who say race doesn't exist at all, right? It just exists to oppress and subjugate certain groups of people, which to me is the same as them saying racism exists, because if we're talking about subjugation and oppression, then that's would be most people's definition, part of most people's definition as it pertains to racism. And so again, the question becomes a meaningful one, I think, or a meaningful point of exploration, which is how do we conceive of race, and is there an alternative to the default naturalist or constructionist position? And in that way, I do view my work as a sort of correctivism. And from what I know of your work, and something that really resonates with me, is I see a lot of your correctivism as doing the work that I do as a skeptic. And so I'm wondering if you are a constructionist or if you're a skeptic. But I will say too that constructionists have a healthy amount of skepticism too. So they're not exactly mutually exclusive. But I think the profound difference between constructionism and skepticism is a constructionist will say race doesn't exist, but it exists because in society in some way. Whereas I say it doesn't exist, period, full stop. People think it does, but that doesn't mean it does. So that's kind of the fundamental difference. But constructionists, such as my advisor, he's very skeptical, of course, of the category. But do you see yourself as a constructionist or a skeptic?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's just too rare that folks get to do what you and I are doing in many different ways, but the one that comes to mind right now is holding language loosely, right? And not becoming captive, to nomenclature, terminology, jargon, that for whatever set of reasons has become familiar and functional to us, and really seeing that, it's meaning that matters, right? So when we've been talking about eliminativism, skepticism, constructivism, correctivism, there are important differences, there's no doubt about it. But the Venn diagram of, the common ground within those things, I think that's what's so valuable and so important to sort of recognize. And then we just refine and refine and refine from there. And for me, it's all about an approach to something, because it's the praxis that matters, right? We are talking conceptually and cerebrally and all that stuff, which I know both of us love, but we're also acting. There is a really important sort of activism without all the sort of negative political stuff that people throw onto that is what this is about, right? So what is the best approach, to be goofy again, to make the world a better place regarding this stuff? And I think it includes the parsing and grafting and sort of refining of the terminology we're talking about here. So, I view the constructionist or constructivist sort of perspective as one that wants to remind us that all sorts of constructions in the world, Carlos, and because few of them root to empirical bases, doesn't mean that they're not quote unquote real in their way, because people act on them, et cetera, et cetera. So that's, that's important, but it's not the quest. It doesn't speak to what to do. It just helps to understand its analysis. It's like an X-ray, right? I often say to kids, empathy is an X-ray, right? It gives you a chance to see what's going on inside something. Then you have to decide what to do. Just like the doctor, might take an X-ray of your arm and say, yeah, there's a hairline fracture there. Nothing to be done about it. It's going to heal itself, or if I try to do something, it would make it worse. So the decision about what to do comes later. And constructivism helps us to understand, I guess, that sort of thing. Skepticism, I tend to think of as a very healthy, disposition and discipline of not taking at face value, things that are received. And then there is, I guess, this active resistance to things that we've decided are harmful, whether or not they're powerful, and permeate society or whatever it might be. And I think that's, what your very good reaction is to folks who say, yeah, but it's so big and whatever, we can't get rid of it. I think that's a lethal concession to a difficult problem. Like, there are difficult problems in the world. Slavery was one of them, right? We don't back away from it though, just because it's going to be difficult to move through it. We keep moving. So I'm with you on that. And and this is a little bit different from the, answering the question you just wrote, but the other thing that I wanted to jot down to make sure I tried to come back to before we left each other is the relationship between resisting racism and resisting the idea of race. There's a writer, his name is, I think he's a he, but that could be an assumption actually. Donal, Muir's last name, Muir. And I think the title is something like Race, the Mythic Root of Racism. And Muir just goes for it, and Muir sort of makes it clear, and obviously I agree, which is why I'm saying it, that the belief or embrace of the concept of race is racism, right? You can't have it like two ways, right? There is no such thing as race that is apart from what racism is, because the embrace of race is the acceptance of the idea that people, first of all, can be divided into these categories that don't exist. And, that concept is predicated on hierarchy, which is why I say sometimes quite deliberately, provocatively, that racial equality is an oxymoron, like, sorry, right? So I think, I just want to sort of put that out there in front of people who are viewing this, just to be clear about it. Not, I hope, to be mean or to start a fight, but to at least offer that, it is that clear in my brain that we really can't have them both. What that then does for some people is say, oh, now you're telling me to sort of deny my race or whatever, which takes us back to a piece of conversation we had in the beginning. And although it might seem like a weird both and, but I both believe that. And I understand that some folks still will embrace the term, and the construct of race as that thing that they live in because they're not ready to leave it. They might not ever be ready to leave it, or they really feel that they found some way to rehabilitate it or reclaim it in some way that says, no, I'm not getting rid of this right now, Carlos. And I welcome discussions with folks like that, because I actually think that that's where movement comes. So I just wanted to share that as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I hope this isn't the last time. I have a sneaking suspicion this won't be the last time that we have a conversation.
Oh, definitely not. See, no, because now you're going to be burdened with both my interest and affection. So no, yeah. However busy your life is, it's just going to get busier now.
The feeling is so mutual, so I welcome it, and I'm really glad. If you don't mind, or if you just want it to be a sort of teaser so that people can watch your TED Talk, I understand. But I actually had intended to bring up the jars that you have conveniently on your desk there, because I felt like it was such a powerful moment in the TED Talk, and I was like, that is brilliant. I need to incorporate this in any aspect of what I do and cite him on it, because it's brilliant. I thought it was really powerful. And your response to the audience, when you give them a second and then you start talking about how they probably perceive of the jars, right? And you talk about like, surprise, you're racist, and you don't say it as an indictment. To me, it came across as I would say it, which is more as a sort of matter of fact, because if you believe in the concept of race, then by default, indeed, that to me is part of my definition of racism, or being racist. And the good news is it's not immutable, right? You can easily correct that, to borrow from your language, and hopefully more people than not would feel inspired to indeed correct how they conceive of themselves and how they conceive of other people. And so I don't know what you can say about the jars that you have there, but if you but I also have it queued on the TED Talk. I could share my screen, but I want to talk about this because it's just really, really powerful, Carlos, and I know I'm going to borrow from it, so we might as well share it with people.
Yeah, let's do it. I mean, one of the nice things about this is that it can be short or long. Sometimes I use slides, which is, I guess, what I did in the TED Talk. And slides sort of give one, because I'm going to speak as if other people are doing this now, but they give one sort of a latitude to move in certain ways and intersperse other things in there, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously in the talk, I also put up that photo of my son and myself. But when I have the jars just themselves, and I will do a how-to, like it's like a cooking program now, right? So these are literally 3 separate jars that Carlos glued together. That's all they are, right? And then I filled one with a substance, one with another substance, one with another substance, and I put labels on them. And in terms of the device, that's all one needs. And then the process is, what do you see? Well, actually, I usually begin by saying, especially when I'm working with young people, one of my favorite things is to give us a chance to see how our brains work, right? And how we think about things. So we're going to do this exercise. And all you have to do is sort of think and then answer the questions. What do you see? And people will say, I see 3 jars, I see glass, I see metal tops, I see numbers, they seem to be written on tape, like, especially with kids, like the brains go all over the place. How are they being held together? I can't see the glue. Are they taped together, et cetera? And I use every single opportunity I can to sort of congratulate them. Wow, look at what your brain is doing. Look at what you notice. And as time goes on, I say, isn't it interesting that we're all looking at exactly the same thing, but different minds have different ideas about it, this diversity, of intelligence and interpretation and thought. That's such a wonderful human thing. So I try to put that in there too. And then we get to the big questions. So which 2 jars, hold the substances that are most alike, would you say? And almost unavoidably, the brain goes to the ones that look alike, right? So I'll say, so people will say number 1 and number 3. Why? Oh, because they look so much alike, right? And if the people are actually holding the jars in their hands and they're looking at it like this, they still look super alike. And I say, okay, which 2 look the most different? Well, we think 1 and 3 are the same, and 2 is obviously different, so it's different from them. All right, what do you think is in the jars then? And then we have this wonderful guessing game, and it's like nutmeg, and it's pepper, and it's, oh, they're all the same, but one is just colored differently. So all sorts of wonderful sort of suggestions and guesses are being made. And then finally, it's the big reveal. And I let folks know that 1 jar has salt in it, 1 jar has brown sugar, 1 jar has white sugar. And people who knew it all along applaud, and people who are wrong like moan a little bit, and that's fun too. And then the question comes back, well, now that we know what's in them, which 2 are most alike, right? And particularly with younger kids, sometimes it's hard for them to move from the optics. Well, the 2 that look alike are still most alike. But again, even with younger kids, they know that sugar is sugar, and that brown sugar and white sugar are still sugar. So they have to be the ones that are more alike. And salt, and I will do the thing about cereal that I did in the TED talk, like how many of you would accept brown sugar instead of white sugar if you wanted some on your cereal? Just about everybody who's had brown sugar, but not salt. Don't put salt on my cereal, which again reinforces the inherent, if not the optical difference. And then I asked, does anybody know what the difference is between brown sugar and white sugar? It's just one thing, right? And there's usually somebody in the room, even with the youngest kids, who knows it's it's molasses, right? Just one thing. And then we ask sort of then, what is the takeaway? What do we take from this, et cetera, et cetera? And, even with youngest kids, I will bring an image of my son and myself, which is where now? Okay. And then we go through some similar questions. So this is from the book. This is one, his name is Evan. I call him Evie, even though he's now 27 and towers over me. And so the question, what is alike about these 2 people? What's different about them? And adults usually get where this is going, but with younger kids, they don't necessarily think that these 2 people are related, right? They just see what they can pretty much identify as me with a person next to me. And with young kids, I've gotten that that person is female. I've gotten that maybe it's my wife, maybe it's a friend of mine, but it can take a while for them to like understand that these 2 people are biologically related, which is why I tend to say like, Evan is my son, my biological son, right? I made him, which is a joke that I do in the talk. So that then sort of finishes up the exercise with the question of what is the difference? Like what makes skin dark? It's just one thing. And it's just a nice coincidence that, melanin and molasses begin with M because the connections are really, really easily reinforced for folks. So you're right, as you observed, it's a really powerful and effective and fun, right? And it's not an emotionally charged, way at getting at, for me, what is actually the crux of this whole thing. Like bad thinking leads to bad behavior, right? So let's, try to think clearly about things.
Brilliant. Brilliant. I absolutely love it. I've watched the TED Talk a few times now, and every single time I'm like, brilliant. And every single time I see you put a picture up from your book cover, also brilliant. I would love to see a recent picture of him. That has to happen, even if offline. So how old was he in that picture? Do
I
you
always have to
remember?
consult with my wife. I think he must have been around 10.
Ah,
We were
I
actually in Costa Rica when that photo was taken.
nice.
I got back to Costa Rica for the first time ever when I was 40 years old. My dad took me back for my 40th birthday. And then our family, me and Leslie and Lauren, who's our daughter, and Evan, went back a couple of times actually. And this photo was taken by Leslie some day when we were just hanging out together. And I
It's
took
a
obvious
beautiful
reasons
photo.
loved it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a beautiful photo. I have 2-year-old triplets,
Oh my gosh.
Carlos. So yeah, you
2-year-old
can
triplets. Wow.
if you remember those days times three.
Well, and
Um,
my wife is a mirror twin, so I have a sense of like, what it is to sort of grow up that way. Somebody who's
mm,
like, "What? You're me? Wait a minute, am I you?" And then for the four parents, yeah, it's a lot. I know.
yeah, because so I have 2 boys and a girl, and my boys are identical twins. And so we get to have the fun of having identicals and also having triplets. And yeah, it's a trip. um but yeah, so the exercise resonates with me even on a personal level, and it's so powerful. Thank you for sharing it. I'm going to link to all of the ways in which people should connect with you, and I want to welcome an opportunity for you to say any closing words of wisdom, if you may, before we part ways. The floor is yours.
Well, I don't know if it's going to be wisdom, but I will share two things that I want to work on that I know would be better, with your participation and partnership. And I guess also uh, represent an invitation to whoever will be watching this. One is that I heard from a fellow who signed up to be part of my dissertation work again like 10 years ago. I heard from him periodically, and then I guess he saw the TED talk, and we connected around that. And I finally had an actual talk with him, not just email, because I just have a little bit more time than I usually do these days. We had a lovely talk, and his name is Peter, and one of the things that Peter has been wishing for is an opportunity to form a bit of a community, and be able to connect with folks who share this perspective. So I actually drafted, I think just yesterday, an invitation to, I don't know what to call it, a discussion group. We'll see where it goes, for folks who do share this orientation around identity. So I'll certainly give you that link too. And what I would say to anybody who's watching this who might be interested is that we will see where it goes. But let's begin by giving each other to actually be in a space with other folks who sort of share this, talk a little bit about our individual stories, and then ask the question, what do we do with all of this? Because it's really cool, again, to see the arc, this bad idea moving as it is. So that's one thing. The other is, and this isn't as well formulated, but I'm sure you can help me with this because, as I said, you have quite a mind. I feel as if we should try to bring together something that looks like a conference, or I don't know what it would be, but folks like you and me and Rainier, if he's interested, and others who would sort of serve as the quote unquote panel, but the idea being to facilitate an opportunity for folks to learn about, even if they don't necessarily agree with this, even if they have high eyebrows when they hear about it, but just to sit together at some point when COVID allows, in a space and do some small group, some responding to some prompts, and really start to dig into this in a way that really hasn't happened yet, in the history of this discourse. So those are two things that I'm really eager to, see materialize, and certainly that I welcome help on. So I'll leave those. Those aren't wisdom, they are opportunities, I think, for all of us to collaborate and do the best we can with all of this.
Yes, that sounds amazing. And great minds really do think alike. Not that I think so highly of myself, but the saying goes, minds think alike. And I was recently thinking about similar things. In fact, I don't know if you're familiar with the app Discord, but people who support my work put me on to Discord. And for a while, I was part of somebody else's Discord. And I kind of appreciated the fact that I didn't have to be a sort of administrator and like do all of the work or anything. But then more recently, I had more people reach out to me and ask, can we just have a Discord that focused just on these alternative, ways of thinking about race and things like that? So I created my own Discord, which I'm happy to share the link. Both in the description box, but also, of course, with you, Carlos, because ultimately I find that people are really hungry for expanding their knowledge and hungry for alternatives that give more people what at least most people say they want, which is a sort of healing from racism, reconciliation, and unification across so-called racial lines. And it's just the fact that unfortunately too many people aren't aware that our kinds of ideas really exist. But I find that once people dive in and engage, they respond very positively and very reasonably to the evidence. And so, yeah, I welcome a discussion group such that you've described. I also think that the Discord I've already started organizing and creating and inviting people to can be a place or at least an extension of that. And I definitely welcome an opportunity to brainstorm and think about what, a retreat, a conference, whatever we want to call it, of sort of like-minded thinkers, but obviously a sort of open invitation to people who are just eager to learn and want to hear more. Because one thing I've noticed, and I think this is really what you were saying earlier, so this brings us 360, is that it seems like such a small world, and people who think differently about this are aware of other people who think differently about this, and that's how the world, you come into contact with one another, which I think is a good thing, because I'm kind of like you too. I'm overwhelmed to see so much out there. I mean, it's not mainstream or anything, certainly, but people who think differently about these things exist and are out there. And every single time I'm like, yes, let's have this conversation, let's connect. But that being said, I'm obviously passionate about making these conversations open to the public, because more people deserve to hear alternatives and deserve to expand their thinking about this, as you said, very complex and also very important and critical topic. I can't thank you enough, Dr. Carlos Hoyt. I truly can't thank you enough. The feeling is so mutual, and I look forward to doing more with you. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Sheena Mason, right back at you. It's been really heartwarming. I mean, you've gone through the PhD experience. I'm sure you can imagine like those days when I was like proposing this even as a topic. I had some pretty serious pushback, from some folks like, what? But then obviously some really important and loving support. Back in the days when like, what are you even talking about? Back in the days when things like nigrescence theory and racial identity theory were like, and they still are, still sort of the canon of how we think about these things. And to, have discovered like that you're out there, and to go through your website and see like the number of folks that you've had great conversations with, and hear about the Discord app that you just talked about, like it's amazing to me. And I don't get amazed very easily. So thank you for being you, and persevering through the character shaping adversity, that I know you have moved through, and I look forward to, and I insist that we continue to be, since we've started, collaborators, and I'm sure very good friends. So it's wonderful to know you.
Couldn't have said it better. I'm going to go off and cry tears of joy and gratitude. Thank you. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. Love, light, and liberation.